Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I want to go over the problem of divine hiddenness and give some of my thoughts and my perspective on this particular problem. And similar to all of my other videos going over critiques of Christianity or theism, I'm going to start by kind of framing this problem and steelmanning it as best as I can. So in simplest terms, divine hiddenness just refers to the idea that God is hidden or absent or silent. We cry out for God, and we hear nothing in response. And it makes sense. We don't see God like we do this pen, for example. We don't see God like we do this mouse, for example. And for many of us, we don't feel God's presence in any meaningful way whatsoever. We don't even feel the effects of his presence like we would with another immaterial thing like love, for example. So for a non-believer, this hiddenness of God indicates to them that he does not exist. And personally, I empathize with this reasoning at an emotional level. Why would I believe in something that I've never seen any indication of its existence? I don't believe in unicorns, for example. I don't believe in aliens, for example. And the reason I don't believe in these things is because I've never seen them. Or seen any pictures of them or any indication of them existing. And personally, just going to my sort of Christian journey or my journey of faith, the hiddenness of God when I deconverted in high school was probably one of the biggest emotional reasons for my deconversion. You could, if you went back and read my journals from that time, you could probably see tons of entries of me talking about like, where is God? Why aren't you answering my prayers? What is your plan? I don't see any of this. None of this makes sense. I don't know who you are. I've never seen you. This makes no sense. Why should I believe in you still? And at the time, I'd investigate all of these abstract arguments for God's existence, like Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways or fine-tuning arguments or any of these different arguments. I'd go in and investigate all of these things and listen to all of the debates, but deep down, at the end of the day, God just never seemed real to me because of this problem of divine hiddenness. And what Christian or former Christian can't relate to this feeling of crying out to God for an answer to his prayers or to some injustice and hearing absolutely nothing in response? I kind of felt something like this recently, or thought about something like this recently when reading the chapter Rebellion in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I've been reading that book recently, and that chapter I think I read this week at one point, and it really struck me. Just the way they describe the injustice here and like this crying out for justice and not hearing anything in response. But I guess to explain it here, the character of Ivan describes the cruel injustice that occurs so frequently in the world, and in particular they talk about injustice against children. Things can get pretty graphic and involve like invasions and just a lot of just terrible stuff that I probably wouldn't want to say on YouTube, but recommend reading the chapter because I think it does a really good job of portraying kind of the evil in the world. But the character of Ivan, he describes the injustice that occurs so frequently in the world and how it feels so often as if there's no answer. And there seems to be no even plausible way for there to be justice in some of these situations. And I'm not going to address the problem of evil here, but my point here is that regardless of how compelling our theodicies may be in responding to this problem, there's something that's so existentially terrifying about God's seeming silence in the face of all of the suffering and all of this injustice in the world. And to add another aspect to this argument, wouldn't we expect an all-loving God who's going to judge us for lack of belief to reveal himself a bit more clearly to us? I'll often hear atheists say, like, an all-knowing God should know exactly what it would take for us to believe. And an all-loving God should provide that to us, right? If he's all-loving, he should give us what we need to be saved, at minimum, right? And maybe this could make sense if all atheists were just resistant, or if all atheists were just very clearly resisting God, like they had everything they needed, just resisting it. But what if we started to talk about non-resistant non-belief? Famously, J.L. Schellenberg puts forward this argument that non-resistant non-belief disproves the existence of an all-loving God, because otherwise, if he was loving, he would reveal himself to these people. They're not resisting. And I think this argument has become extremely popular among non-believers. And I'm going to show briefly Alex O'Connor making it here. I'm not going to play the whole video. It's 10 minutes long, but I'll try to play a snippet and then cut it off at a point that feels reasonable. I just want to get it in his words first. So let's jump to that.
Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. They're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not. There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely...
Okay, I think that's a good point to stop it at, just because he got through his premises and conclusion. So I think he did a really good job of presenting that argument in a very clear and concise sort of way. So I think hopefully you guys get a good understanding of kind of the force behind this argument now. So now let's start getting into some of my thoughts on this particular argument. So just to begin with, I want to mention that divine hiddenness is seen all throughout the Bible. While there are passages like Psalm 139, verse 7 that say, "Where shall I go to flee from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence?" that may seem to imply that God is inescapable. The same person who wrote that line in Psalm 139 also wrote, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. And that's Psalm 22, verses 1 and 2. And this sentiment, these exact words are even reiterated by Jesus just before his death in Mark 15:34. And at the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. I probably completely butchered that pronunciation, but whatever. Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So you can see this sort of feeling of abandonment and hiddenness of God is all throughout the Bible. Additionally, for another example, you can see the book of Job is filled with this sentiment of divine hiddenness. For example, Job 23:8-9, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. On the left hand, when he is working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him. So basically, what we can see here is that the Bible is full of this acknowledgement and struggle with this problem of divine hiddenness. It's grappled with all throughout the Bible, not just those few verses. I think those are the clearest examples. In fact, I would argue that this sort of emotional struggle and the struggle with doubt is an essential feature of the Christian walk through life. We're disconnected from God. We're fallen creatures. We're disconnected from God. We can't see him. We're separated from him. So we need a savior provided in Christ. That's the gospel. So that's one thing I think is important to acknowledge up front. These biblical examples show that this is a real problem. This is something that Christians do have to grapple with. We are disconnected from God, but that doesn't not need to lead to unbelief. It didn't do so for any of these biblical writers. And the reality is that the journey of faith, there's always going to be doubt throughout that journey. We are disconnected from God. That's like a very essential part of the Christian worldview, and a very essential part of what the gospel even is. We are disconnected from God. He is hidden from us. And so the reality is that our journey of faith is going to be filled with doubt. And the Christian worldview acknowledges this and ultimately encourages perseverance through this. I think all of these examples, like the Psalms and Job and all of this stuff, are examples of like we should persevere through these trials and this hiddenness from God. But okay, so with that out of the way, let's go into let's address this concept of divine hiddenness head on, because the reality is that God has revealed himself in certain ways, and we can see his fingerprints everywhere we look. So there is something to the statement, to the passage of Psalm 139:7, where it's like, where shall I flee from your spirit? Where shall I flee from you? Like, there is a sense in which God's fingerprints are everywhere we look, but it's not always obvious to us. There is a disconnect, as I was mentioning. So St. Paul, in one of my favorite passages in Romans, he says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And that's Romans chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. And the main point here is that God has revealed himself through his creation. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived in certain ways. Even though he is hidden from us in a certain sense, he transcends this world. In a sense, we do perceive his fingerprints. We do see things that point to him in the world. And a good formulation that I've heard that kind of expresses the ways in which God has revealed himself is revealing himself in 3 C's. I think it was Gavin Orland that I got this from, but I don't remember if it's specifically him or not. But the 3 C's being creation, consciousness, and Christ. So let's start off with creation. How does God reveal himself through creation? And the main point here is that we can see the fingerprints of the Creator on his creation. Intellectually, we have arguments like the fine-tuning argument, the contingency argument, and these two arguments particularly are considered two of the most compelling arguments for God's existence. And they're ultimately based on the idea that the very nature of the external world, or the very nature of God's creation, necessitates a creator in some way. And you can go do your own research on those particular arguments. Just for the sake of time, I want to not dwell too much on those. I'll make videos on those, I'm sure, at some point. The contingency argument for sure is on my list. I think it's one of the better arguments. And I guess aside from these intellectual arguments, because as I mentioned before, a lot of times the abstract arguments, they don't really give you a sense of who God is and where to find him. I think for a more emotionally compelling understanding of how creation points to God, just for a personal way of thinking about this, I encourage you to just go into nature, go on a hike to some beautiful like overpass or something, or like a beautiful viewpoint, or go out and watch a sunset, and you'll see that there's this sense of transcendence involved there. And this is strictly emotional. I'm sure you could go in and logically pick all of this apart, but I think from an emotional sense, there's this sense of something transcendent beyond all of this beauty in nature. There's a sense of something more to all of this. And it's difficult to put a finger on, but I do think that this transcendence ultimately points to God, which is something that I've explained in my Transcendental Arguments for God video. I think I briefly touched on it in my Why I'm a Christian video. So for more elaboration on that particular point of that transcendence, why it points to God, you can watch those videos. But I think ultimately you go out and you can see that you can feel the sense of transcendence there. And I think that ultimately points to God. Next, let's look at the second thing that points to God, and that's consciousness. Intellectually, the transcendental argument for God's existence, and more controversially, the ontological argument, are examples of showing how our consciousness, the very structure of our logic and conceptual faculties, points to God. These arguments both kind of take this a priori approach that shows how sort of the very structure of our cognition points to God. And I find that these arguments can be very abstract and very difficult to grasp the intuitive force behind them, though I do really love the transcendental argument for God. And you can watch my video on how the transcendentals point to God to see kind of the way I formulated that and elaborated and expanded on different premises. However, for me, I see more of the force behind God's revelation through consciousness when doing math. I love math. If you watch this channel long enough, if you subscribe to this channel, you're going to see math videos pop up in your feed. I love math. I think it's beautiful. And I think the conceptual beauty of math, its interconnectedness is just incredibly beautiful, and in a similar way to how looking at nature points to something transcendental, I get a similar sense of transcendence when doing mathematics and seeing the interconnectedness of it. And I find that the way that it almost inexplicably and miraculously appears in reality, despite even these like very complex and abstract like pure number theory sort of ideas, the way, no matter how abstract and disconnected it tends to get from reality at times, it still finds some way to make its way into reality and to appear in reality in some way. And I think all of that conceptual nature of it, I think, and that transcendence and beauty and interconnectedness, I think that points to God as well, in a certain sense. Okay, and then finally, I think, most importantly, God reveals himself through Christ. God literally became a man and walked through life with us at a certain point in history. He taught for a few years, was crucified, and resurrected, and very shortly after his death and resurrection, this ministry of Christ was documented afterwards by witnesses of the resurrected Jesus. And it was preserved in the New Testament, in the New Testament that we have today. Now, this presentation of the history behind this is shortened for brevity. So go if you have more questions, because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's up for dispute in that particular presentation. Watch my video on the historical evidence for Jesus. I fleshed that out a little bit more with a more thorough historical analysis, I hope. But the main point is, if you agree with me on this historical, on the history here, the point is that God revealed himself through the person of Jesus Christ. And there's historical documentation of this event that's worth investigating. So basically, overall, the reality is that God has revealed himself in three ways: creation, consciousness, and Christ. And then along with that, I want to tack this one on kind of at the end, because it's a little bit more disputable. But along with that, I think there's countless examples of modern day miraculous healings. And I put a lot less confidence in these in this point versus the other three, but I think it's still worth mentioning. But for brevity, I think this video is going to be long as it is. I'm just going to list a few places to look to find examples. There's a YouTube channel called Testify that goes over a bunch of these miraculous healing claims. I think a lot of the Catholic saint healings, they have a very surprisingly well-documented process for canonizing saints that requires certain miracles and requires like a certain high level of scientific proof for these to be miraculous healings. I think another specific example, there's the Wesley Huff example of him surviving paralysis. I'm sure that one has probably been analyzed to death just because he's such a public figure now. And then along with that, there's just a statistic from Pew Research saying that 29% of Christians in the U.S. say that they have witnessed divine healings. Now, we can just dismiss all of this and say all these people are lying or they're all mistaken, but I think that seems a little bit reckless. And I think that some, if not most, are likely lying, I would struggle with saying that all of them are wrong with absolute certainty. And I certainly think that it provides a strong counterexample to anyone who just claims that the idea of divine intervention or miracles or the supernatural is just absurd on its face, that this just goes against all of our understanding of reality, all of our intuitions of how the world works. There's a lot of people who've claimed that they've witnessed these things. I think there's more up for debate here, that we can't just axiomatically dismiss all of these things, like I think a lot of materialists and atheists tend to do. I think a lot of people hold materialism as this sort of like, oh yeah, this is obviously true, this is intuitively true, without ever having justified that particular worldview, the idea that there are no supernatural claims. They just think that supernatural claims are silly or that they don't make sense. So then they just dismiss them out of hand without much of an argument. But the problem is, given that so many people have witnessed these sort of things and claim that they've witnessed these sort of things, it's very difficult to make that sort of leap, I think. And I think it's reckless from a philosophical perspective. But next, so I think that's it for what I'm going to talk about with how God reveals himself. So we have our 4 points that we see that God has revealed himself in 4 ways: creation, consciousness, Christ, miraculous healings. So with all of those, I think the next point that I want to talk about is, we see that God has revealed himself in all of these ways. However, I think for many, that is not enough on its own. These forms of revelation are still not quite clear enough for many people. There's still a lot of room for them to continue doubting. They're still not convinced. And the problem here is that I think the problem here is that we want God to behave based on our expectations. But God is not part of creation that we can walk up to and physically interact with. Like, I don't see God right here. I don't see God right here. He's the creator, and because of that, he transcends creation by the very definition. While he can interact with creation and provide us with certain signs and miracles, it does not make sense for us to fully see God physically in all of his glory and all of his grandeur, as God's infinite attributes could never be fully expressed in finite creation. Now, God did enter the world for us to directly perceive him through Christ, but we didn't recognize him. We saw him as just another person. We saw him as this like crazy person saying he's God, and crucified him. But either way, our expectations about God's revelation to us de-emphasize his transcendence. I think even if God appeared right in front of us, for a lot of us, the most rational explanation would seem to be that it's hallucinations, or we'd come up with some other natural explanation for why God appeared right in front of us, because we can't express the infinite right in front of us. The right in front of us is necessarily finite in nature. So I think in that sense, revelation through noticing transcendent beauty or through math, like mentioned before, might actually be a more fitting way for God to reveal himself. We can see fingerprints in reality that point to something transcendent, but you can't see the transcendent within the thing that it transcends. That doesn't make any sense. Or you can't see that thing fully. I think expanding on this, a lot of times resistance to God is often understated as well. This is kind of a different point. When I was an atheist, even, I guess expanding on the point about God appearing right in front of us, and a lot of us being more likely to think that it might be hallucinations or some other natural explanation, that kind of being the most rational way to think about it. I think resistance to God is often understated. I think when I was an atheist, even a direct revelation in this sense of God sitting right next to me would not have been enough to convince me, because of my commitment to this non-existence of the supernatural. I had this axiomatic commitment to the idea that the supernatural is impossible. And I think this is also the case for atheists, like, for example, Richard Dawkins. There's a famous clip of Richard Dawkins where they ask him what would persuade him to believe in God. And we're going to go over that right now. Let me switch that quick.
What would it take for you to believe in God?
Well, I used to say it would be very simple. It would be, the second coming of Jesus, or a great big, deep, booming bass Paul Robeson voice saying, "I am God and I created." But I was persuaded mostly by actually Steve Zara, who's a regular contributor to my website, richarddawkins.net. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice and the second coming in clouds of glory, the more probable explanation is that it's a hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield or something. He made the point that a supernatural explanation for anything is incoherent, that it just doesn't it doesn't add up to an explanation for anything.
So what would persuade you?
Well, I'm starting to think nothing would, which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. The trouble is, I can't think what that evidence would look like.
Okay, so yeah, that's Richard Dawkins basically going over why, even if God appeared right in front of him, or he heard the big booming voice and all of that sort of stuff, he still wouldn't believe, because he has that fundamental belief that supernatural explanations are ultimately incoherent. And while there are likely many atheists who are open to belief, I think that many more atheists than we may realize are like Dawkins, in that they would not accept God even if he, quote-unquote, revealed himself. As such, I think non-resistant non-belief, as we were kind of talking about before with the whole concept of divine hiddenness, I think non-resistant non-belief is often overstated. Many atheists claim that God is hidden without ever having given an honest try to look for him. And if you want to find these atheists, all you'll need to do is scroll down to the comment section. I'm sure there's a ton of atheists who are proving this exact point, as have been on many of my videos. But so many atheists believe absurd things about God and Christianity that it only would take the slightest bit of seeking, the slightest bit of non-resistance to debunk. For example, there's still atheists that claim that Jesus never existed or was just some mythical figure, and that's a claim that even the slightest attempt to engage with any level of scholarship on the topic could easily debunk. But yeah, so I think one point is that non-resistant non-belief is very understated. But even in the case of non-resistant non-belief, I think our expectations about God's love might be flawed. In his video on divine hiddenness, Gavin Ortland uses the example of Old Man Marley from Home Alone to kind of illustrate this point. At the beginning of the movie, Kevin's older brother tells him that Old Man Marley is a serial killer, and Kevin is afraid of him, views him as evil, and later it turns out that he's actually just a loving person, and eventually he saves him from the wet bandits. And the point here that Gavin was making is that we can have false expectations about how a loving human may behave. And I think for a more personal example, I'll give my own example rather than just copying Gavin. In a relationship, we're not going to always understand how our partner shows love. I think anybody who's in a relationship can understand this point. People don't behave exactly how we'd expect them to, and people have different ideas of what exactly love looks like. And I think they're different people. They show love differently. They have different understandings of what it means. That doesn't mean that their love for you doesn't exist. It just means that the way that they show love doesn't meet our expectations. Now, it's hard enough to grasp how another person might show love, but consider how difficult it might be to understand God's love. God's an omniscient, transcendent being. His considerations and his concerns are likely so much different from ours that we could never even comprehend. And as a result of this, the way that he shows love might differ significantly from our expectations. As a result, he might have perfectly good reasons for not revealing himself to all the non-resistant non-believers in a manner that convinces them. Now, I don't claim to know what God's reasons are, and if I did, I'd fall into the same trap of the people that I'm critiquing who tout this argument about divine hiddenness, this problem of divine hiddenness, in order to disprove God. I'd be falling into that same trap if I pretended like I know exactly what God's reasons are. You just don't understand them. You don't get it. I get it. I'd be falling into that same trap. None of us, God transcends all of us. We're not going to be able to understand the way that God functions, the way that God works. However, I'm going to offer a few potential ideas that may shed light, or at least offer to you the idea that it's possible that God has better reasons, it's possible that God has good reasons, that all loving God has good reasons to not reveal himself to all non-resistant non-believers. First, I want to consider an example from Kierkegaard, the parable of the king and the maiden. So, to set this up, consider a powerful king who falls in love with a poor maiden, and he wants to express his love for her. He wants a genuine connection with her that's based on love. And he realizes, well, he's thinking about how to express his love to her. He's thinking about how he can express his love in a way that he'll know that she loves him back. And then that love is actually based on genuine love, a genuine connection. And he realizes quickly that if he showers her with gifts, he pulls up in like his crown and all of his chariots or whatever. I don't know what kings have. he pulls up with all of that and showers her with gifts, makes her his queen. He's never going to know if she actually loves him. She will probably feel some level of obligation or maybe fear, like, oh, I have to be this this king's bride. Like, obviously he's the king. Like, he could kill me if I don't do that. So the question is, will she? Or I guess he'll. So if he just showers her with gifts, pulls up in all his robes, all that stuff, he's never going to know if she actually loves him or is just pretending to love him out of fear or obligation. As a result, he realizes that the best way to express his love is to disguise himself as a servant to bridge the gap between them and ensure that she loves him out of genuine love and not out of fear or out of obligation or anything like that. Now, I think you can, if you know the gospel, you can kind of see where this is going. If you know who Jesus is, you can kind of see where this is going already. But if God were to reveal, the point basically is, if we consider the perspective of God in his relationship with humanity, we'll quickly realize that God is in the same position as the king when it comes to his relationship with humanity. If God were to reveal himself to us in all of his glory, we would have no choice but to believe. However, if God wants a genuine relationship and not compelled belief, his revelation of himself would need to be some sort of disguised revelation that bridges the gap between us and him, and that's exactly what we get with Jesus. And so in that sense, a genuine relationship between God and humanity necessitates divine hiddenness. We can't see God in all of his glory. Otherwise, we would feel compelled to believe, and we would feel compelled to enter into relationship with him, rather than what we have now, which is sort of a choice. We have the ability to choose to love God. We have the ability to choose to enter into a relationship with him. We have the ability to choose to seek him out and to choose to try to find him. And I think another point to add here, basically, God wants us to seek him. He gave us an intellect and wants us to use that to pursue him and to pursue a relationship with him. Mark 4, verses 11 through 12 says, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. And I think it's clear here that what Jesus is expressing is that he does not want those who do not genuinely desire a relationship with him to understand what he's saying, to see him in his full glory, to see that he is the Son of God. He doesn't wish to reveal himself to those who do not genuinely seek him out and try to actually understand what he's saying and try to actually understand who he is. On the other hand, I think what atheists are demanding, or people who posit the argument from divine hiddenness or the problem of divine hiddenness, they demand this one-way relationship where God does all of the work reaching out. Where God does all of the work reaching out. And to enter into a relationship with somebody, it's insufficient to simply be non-resistant to their love. Like, imagine if I was dating my girlfriend like early on, and I was like, yeah, I'm non-resistant to loving you. I'll love you if you love me. Like, that's not a genuine like seeking of love. That's not expressing love. She would break up with me. She'd be like, who is this guy? And then she'd go and tell her friends and laugh about it. And then go on to the next person. But luckily, I was not simply non-resistant. I actively seeked out love and made that leap of faith and hoped that she loved me. So now we're dating. On the other hand, atheists demand a one-way relationship where God does all the work. To enter this relationship, it's insufficient to simply be non-resistant. In the king and maiden analogy, if we take it back there, the king wants the maiden to want a relationship with him, not just be non-resistant. If he showed up to her with his crown on and professing his love and showering her with gifts. That's not what he wants. He doesn't want her to just be non-resistant when he does that and asks for her hand. He wants her to actively want to seek out relationship. And I think similarly, a genuine relationship with God requires action on our part. So that's the first point. I think it requires us to genuinely seek him. God wants us to actually desire the relationship and not feel compelled by his grandeur and his power, and his ability to punish, basically. He doesn't want us to just love him out of fear of going to hell, which I think hell is ultimately just disconnection from God anyways. So the people who don't believe are ultimately getting what they want. But that's a whole other topic. So that's the first point. I think that's one potential reason, or one potential way of looking at this, that could be a possibly good reason that God may not want to reveal himself to all of us. And I think, or not want to reveal himself to all non-resistant non-believers. I think another possibility, more of like a Calvinist sort of perspective, comes when we emphasize the sovereignty of God. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word. Sovereignty of God. No matter how painful this is to hear, God's not under any obligation to save all of us. All of us at some point in our lives have sinned against God, and so any act, all of us have sinned against God at some point in our lives. So any act by God to reveal himself to us and offer us salvation is an act of mercy inherently, is an act of excessive love compared to what we deserve. So in that sense, his choice to convince some of us, to reveal himself to some of us and not to others, is still consistent with his all-loving nature. He still chooses to love and extend relationship to those who've sinned against him and who, in this context, deserve damnation. And in all honesty, I really struggle a lot with this reason. I struggle a lot with like the Calvinist view of predestination and all of that. I think it's very difficult for me at an emotional level to believe that we all deserve hell. But I do think this reason does very clearly address the problem of divine hiddenness and explain how an all-loving God may not be obliged to reveal himself to all of us. We've broken a covenant with him. We've sinned against him. What obligation is he under to reach out to us now and like force that relationship upon us? I think, and he also has this competing concern of justice. We have a just God as well as a loving God. And I don't think those two are in any contradiction with each other. But okay, that's a more pessimistic point. But I think on a more optimistic note, as sort of a last point and last potential reason to consider, I think we should keep in mind that if you're watching this video, there's still time. For all of us, there's still time. It's possible that God does reveal himself to all non-resistant non-believers at some point. But maybe he just hasn't gotten to you yet. If you're an atheist watching this who claims to be a non-resistant non-believer, maybe he just hasn't gotten to you yet. And I think there's so many cases of even people on their deathbed converting to faith, or having some other conversions later in life. For me, during high school, I was convinced that there was no God. Very much as I explained, like the emotional force behind that was kind of the problem of divine hiddenness. I was convinced that there was no God as a result of that. However, after college, I think God opened my heart and convinced me. He showed me himself in these sort of transcendent ways that I kind of discuss. So I think even if you haven't seen anything... What the heck? Wait, my computer almost went off. Are we still going? Okay, sorry, that was weird. My computer just like blacked out for a few seconds and then I got scared, but we're fine. That's funny. I'm gonna keep that in the video. You can see my like fear for a second. But okay, where were we? I was convinced there's no God during college. After college, God opened my heart, convinced me of his existence. So I think even if you personally have not seen anything to convince you of God yet, I would encourage you to keep on looking. Keep seeking God out. Keep seeking out that relationship. Even if you don't believe now, if you want to believe, and seek him out, I believe that God will reveal himself to you and show him to you in a certain way. And you're never going to be without doubt. That's the reality of the situation. I still have doubts from time to time. It's a hard thing to believe. I don't think the opposite of faith is doubt, though. I don't think that's the case. But yeah, I think it's possible that God reveals himself to all that are open, and I think if you seek him out, you'll find him. And I certainly hope that's the case. I certainly hope it's the case that non-resistant non-believers don't get sent to hell. I hope that God reveals himself to these people. But it's ultimately not anything that I can know or speculate on. But I think back to the central point of this section, because this section, our flawed expectations, has been up here for a fat minute now. So back to the central point, I think all of these reasons could represent possible reasons why an all-loving God does not reveal himself to all non-resistant non-believers. However, it's possible that none of these reasons are true. There might be aspects of truth in any of these. They might all be completely wrong. I might be completely off base. But the point is that our expectations of how an all-loving God will behave do not dictate how that all-loving God will behave. And that he may have perfectly good reasons to not reveal himself clearly to all of us. And I think that is the central point. I think that's the central point of this response. I think God, we went through all these reasons, we went through all these possibilities, but I think the point is that God transcends all of this. God transcends all of this noise, and he may have his own reasons for not wanting to reveal himself to non-resistant non-believers. And it's not really up to us. It's not really up to our expectations or our own minds to dictate the way that God thinks or the way that God behaves. So, yeah. I think that's everything that I have to say for this particular video. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the comment section. If you guys like this video, go down there, leave a like, go hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell. You want to see my videos in your feed. I know you do. You want to see more of this. So just go and subscribe already. Gosh, oh my gosh, subscribe already. And then after that, go on my Patreon. There's a link down there as well. Click on that link. I don't know what Patreon looks like when you click on the link, but there will be some button that'll tell you to donate. Go click on that button. Maybe set the number to like $50 a month or something, or $500. That would be super nice. If you guys send me $500 a month, that would be crazy. No. Yeah, you don't have to, but if you really like the content and want to contribute a little bit, if you think my microphone sucks and want it to get better, that Patreon button's down there. But yeah, okay. And then also I have a Discord. It'd be cool if you guys joined it. I don't use Discord enough though. I feel like if I did, my Discord community would probably be better or bigger, but I don't know. If all of you guys join, we can build something. We can build something down there. We can build a beautiful, thriving Discord community rather than this dead Discord server that we have right now. But, okay. This video's gone on long enough. It's almost 50 minutes. I'm surprised I fit all that in 50 minutes. There's a lot of content. But thank you all for watching, and I really hope you all enjoyed and hope that you guys can see God in your own lives. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.